If the US support begins to go away or to weaken, the Europeans simply don't have the stockpiles to support Ukraine at the level that they need to. So Europe really needs to ramp up its defense industrial capacity. That requires Europeans working together more. That requires new funding. And that doesn't really appear to be in the offing. So the way the Europeans are supporting Ukraine militarily likely needs to shift, and it's unclear whether it will as we go into 2024. Hi, I'm Max Bergmann, Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program in the Stewart Center here at CSIS. And in the CSIS 2024 Global Forecast Report, A World Dividing, I take a look at Europe's surprisingly resilient support for Ukraine and note that this is going to be really tested in 2024. I think it's worth looking back first before we look forward. If you look back over the last 2 years, the response from Europe has actually been incredibly surprising in how strong it was. First, the Europeans shocked everybody, putting in place an incredibly strong sanctions regime, much stronger than they did in 2014 after Russia seized Crimea the first time. Then we saw the EU doing unprecedented things, providing military assistance to Ukraine, doing the training of Ukrainians, which they're currently doing today. A really strong, robust response from Europe and also from European citizens. I think there's a big question of when the energy shock hit European consumers with energy prices rising after Russia cut off the gas and after the Nord Stream pipelines exploded. How would Europe react? What we actually saw was Europeans cutting back on their energy demand, and that enabled Europe to get through it. And we've seen support now 2 years into the war remain really high. But this will be tested going forward into 2024 in a number of ways. First is that the urgency of providing support to Ukraine has some ways diminished. And this is problematic because the war in Ukraine has changed. This is an incredibly brutal conventional war that requires tremendous industrial capacity. The way the Europeans were providing military support to Ukraine was by taking out of their stocks their old equipment and giving that to the Ukrainians. Well, they've essentially run out of stuff. And if the US support begins to go away or to weaken, the Europeans simply don't have the stockpiles to support Ukraine at the level that they need to. So Europe really needs to ramp up its defense industrial capacity. That requires Europeans working together more. That requires new funding. And that doesn't really appear to be in the offing. So the way the Europeans are supporting Ukraine militarily likely needs to shift, and it's unclear whether it will as we go into 2024. The second area is that the Hungarians are becoming increasingly vocal in their opposition to support for Ukraine. They abstained from supporting Ukraine membership talks, and they're blocking Ukraine funding. It looks like the EU will figure out a way to get around that, but that provides a potential obstacle for the EU going forward. The EU will also have elections in June. The European Parliament will go to vote. And there are concerns that if there are populist parties, particularly on the far right, that really increase their strength, that could lead to the EU being less able to support Ukraine, similar to how we're seeing that in the US. The third and final and perhaps most acute challenge is the return of austerity potentially to the EU, where the Europeans are looking at their significant budget deficits that were built up in response to COVID and saying we really need to get our books in order. And this has led to the return of the Stability and Growth Pact. And what this does is essentially put limits on how much of a budget deficit a country can operate. Well, that has vast implications potentially for the amount they're going to be able to spend to support Ukraine to really ramp up their defense industries. So these trends, I think, mean that it's going to be a more difficult environment for Europe to really build up its support to Ukraine or to meet the needs of the Ukrainians as they fight the Russians into 2024. To read the full 2024 Global Forecast Report, please visit csis.org.